So let's consider some of the impact of taking innovation to scale. In the past 10 years, and I'm a lover of facts and figures, as you're going to see, there were 400 new cancer treatments that were approved. Today, do you know how many there are? Today, there are 13,000 medicines in the pipeline. 5,000 of those are for cancer. Preventative care that we were just discussing just now can add up to 9 years of healthy life expectancy. And by 2050, could unlock $12.5 trillion in global economic gains, obviously enabling greater workforce participation and productivity. But, and this is the big but, even though the returns are extraordinary and well documented, investment in health innovation remains at its weakest point in more than a decade. So what I suggest we do now is dig deeper into some of these points and look at how we can transform our approach to medicines and vaccines to really unlock their full potential. To do so, I'd like to begin by introducing our expert panel who bring decades of experience to this discussion. And they are Dr. Monique Vleder, who is the Global Director of Health, Nutrition and Population at the World Bank Group, which is responsible for health system strengthening, financing and service delivery across the world. Do come and join me. We'll also be joined by Dr. Penny Heaton, who is the Global Head of the Office of the Chief Medical Officer at Johnson & Johnson. Now, she leads the company's work on global health challenges, focusing on medical safety, epidemiology, bioethics, and strategic partnerships. We're also joined by Dr. Florica Fink-Huyer, who is the Director General of HERA. Now, that is the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, and that was created to ensure the EU is prepared and responds quickly to cross-border health threats. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Michael Lobritz, who is the Vice President and Global Head of the Infectious Diseases Therapeutic Area at Roche, which is a pioneer in preventing, diagnosing, and treating diseases. So as you can see, we're in great company. So from the discussion so far, I've kind of visualized a kind of virtuous cycle forming, going from investment, innovation, growth, and resilience to building a foundation against future threats. So how we're going to kind of dissect this conversation in some respects is I'm going to turn to Dr. Vleder and Dr. Heaton to explore the first part of this cycle, how investment in health drives innovation and growth. So, Dr. Vleder, turning to you, the World Bank has set a really ambitious target to shift the paradigm on health and help provide 1.5 billion people access to health services by 2030, which is very ambitious. But where are you now with that, and how do medicines and vaccines deliver these productivity returns?
Yeah. Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for IFPMA for convening us. And I was fascinated by your previous conversation as a CEO of AstraZeneca sounded like a world banker talking about productivity and economic growth. And so that was actually the first point I was going to make, that one of the main reasons why we are so interested in the health sector at the World Bank, beyond the importance of health outcomes by itself, is the fact that it very much influences the local economy to the influence it has on productivity. And so it's hard to participate in the workforce when you're sick. But also because the health sector itself is a huge opportunity, has a very large potential for job creation and therefore impacts countries' economic growth. And so we've really made more recently a shift from not just looking at the service delivery part, but also really recognizing that the job creation agenda in the health sector is very, very central. So in terms of the 1.5 billion, we're at 575 million as of today. And we're sort of looking at, in the strategy of reaching the 1.5 billion, which is roughly a doubling of our previous engagement on health, we're looking at 3 different pillars. One is around the AI, digitally enabled primary healthcare platforms. And when we talk about about innovations and integrating innovations and reaching most people with most cost-effective services, well-functioning primary healthcare platforms are really at the core of that. We're innovating a lot with countries in terms of virtual, using pharmacy networks, being much more rigorous around what is really the disease burden and what does a package of services need to look like. And it cannot just be maternal and child health, it has to be non-communicable diseases. We have to take into account the rapid aging in many countries that are still poor. So that's the first pillar. The second one is around the sovereignty of financing. And so when we think about what the financing landscape will look like in 10 years, it will be totally different from now. And that has major implications for who's going to be procuring drugs and vaccines and how will that be organized. And so we do, in 110 countries, we support countries in increasing domestic resources, but also looking at regional ways to regulate and to look at pooled procurement to get better prices, et cetera. And so that's sort of direction we're going of having more domestic financing over time for the health sector is another important part. And then finally, really important for this discussion is the value chain for health. And so we have recently merged our public policy and public financing units with our private investment unit under one directorate, recognizing the importance to connect policy, regulation, and private investments, and bringing all of our financing tools to a local manufacturing agenda for vaccines, pharmaceutical, medical equipment, medical consumables based on the demand and the environment of the private sector in countries. And there's tremendous opportunity there to work together. We see a lot of interest in tech transfers. There's a lot of needs of improving regulatory environment, looking at tax incentives, et cetera. And so it's a really exciting new frontier of the work, which will also enable us to get closer to that goal of quality, affordable services. And as part of that, the availability of affordable commodities and vaccines is a really central part of delivering those quality services.
Thank you. Yeah, it really is a very positive domino effect in some respects. And so, yes, picking up on some of these points of the positive influence on local economies, on job creation, I think it's pretty clear that vaccines and medicines are not a standalone. So from your perspective, Dr. Penny Heaton, how does innovation in vaccines and medicines create value beyond the individual product?
Yeah. So again, thanks to IFPMA for inviting me to be part of this forum, and just want to pick up on your comments. I think I have some people to fill those jobs that you're creating. But I'm a pediatrician and infectious disease physician, and over the course of my career, I've seen clearly that health changes everything, and not just for individuals, but actually for societies, as you've been talking about. So to make it more concrete for you, I started my career studying childhood and infant diarrheal diseases, and I saw firsthand the death and devastation from those diseases. But fast forward 30 years later, and we now have a vaccine against the leading cause of childhood diarrhea, a rotavirus vaccine. Now, of course, it protects against the virus and it helps protect the gut, but it does a lot more than that. The data shows that that vaccine also protects brain growth. It protects education. And you know what? A child that is healthy and learning becomes a productive adult. So that is what I think is the key here, that we have to then, those productive adults, they go on to contribute to society and to actually make their economies better. So I think this is the new message that we have to get out there. I think a lot of us have been talking about this message for a long time, but somehow we have to get the policymakers to see it as well. And what's really exciting for me, yes, I love infectious diseases, but this isn't just in infectious diseases. Now we're starting to see this happen for chronic diseases as well. The data from the U.S. Medicare population study shows that in the 14 years after cardiovascular drugs were introduced into Medicare, that major cardiovascular events dropped by over half. astounding, that investment and what came out of it. So for me, this framing is really straightforward. It's what we've been talking about, that healthcare innovation, it isn't a healthcare expense. It's an investment, and it's an investment in human potential. It's an investment in economic resilience, and it's an investment in long-term growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd be interested to ask you now, if we were to flip this on its head, then, if we look at the other situation where we don't invest in health and don't take these innovations to scale, if we don't have diagnostics, what's the situation there? What's the value to society that's being lost?
Yeah, so I think the value to society that's being lost is really significant. And I see it in 3 areas. I think first, it is prevention. If you think about that if we don't invest in vaccines or in these cardiovascular drugs, et cetera, I think it's one of the biggest economic losses. And, I want to also say, I think we're defining prevention too narrowly. When we think about prevention, a lot of times we talk about, lifestyle changes, eating right, getting your exercise, and please continue that strength training. It will reduce your risk of Alzheimer's. But it really goes beyond that. And it goes even beyond vaccines. It goes even beyond screening. I think we're just in one of the most exciting times in history right now, as far as the biopharmaceutical world goes, where we're actually starting to finally identify biomarkers that are truly predictive of people's risk of disease and their state of disease. So if we don't invest, we lose that ability to intercept disease early, and then we catch it late. So then going on to the second big gap, I think, is that early diagnosis. It's so important for us to diagnose things early and catch them early. If we don't, what happens, and this is what happens unfortunately most of the time, finally, patients come in for care when the care is most expensive and the most costly and the most burdensome on the healthcare system. I mean, in the US, we estimate that people spend the last 12 years of their life with a chronic disease, and that's in ill health from that chronic disease. So we really have to figure out, prevent, diagnose early, and then finally, the third thing is deployment. We really have to get our interventions and innovations to everyone who needs them. The statistics show that in low resource settings, only 1/3 have access to essential medicines. That's just devastating. And even in high-income countries now, we're seeing these healthcare deserts. I was shocked when one of my colleagues at J&J told me that his physician in New Jersey did not know about some of the healthcare innovations that we've had for cancer. So I think that deployment across all of the healthcare deserts or low resource settings is really impossible, and it's still a huge gap. So the opportunity, I think, it's not just bringing novel innovations to market, so to speak, but it's actually the early and consistent deployment of those innovations that's so important.
Yeah, so prevention, diagnosing, intervention, early, and access. And as you said so clearly, health changes everything. And I think this evening we've heard the data. I think everybody understands the arguments. The data is there. So then we're dealing with governments who have shorter cycles, who aren't looking at the long-term investment. So Dr. Vleda, what would your advice be to these governments to encourage them to pivot and to invest in health innovations up front, rather than, as Dr. Heaton was saying so clearly, kind of have to absorb those very heavy costs later?
So I fully agree with the focus and the strong emphasis on prevention. I think that's really important, but also want to translate some of it into the reality of low-income settings, where it's really very challenging to even reach the most basic, right? And so from our latest health finances data, so on average, a low-income country has $16 per capita, a basic package of services with the commodities, so the pharmaceutical pharmaceuticals and vaccines associated is $60 per capita, right? And so, and half of the $16 is dependent on donor contributions that are also reducing at the moment. And so our day-to-day dialogue is very much around that, right? That we need to find ways to use very scarce resources in the most effective way to be able to deliver quality primary care services to the most possible people, right? And so that's for very low-income countries, our day-to-day conversation. Now and then it varies because not every context is the same, and so I just want to give a couple of examples. I understood Minister Budi should have been here. We work very closely with him, partly on a massive and very ambitious expansion of his primary healthcare program and improvement in the quality of the delivery of it. He has a fantastic vision for it, but combined with investments in the vaccine industry that also is accompanied with a tech transfer from a global company or an international company, and a very accompanying that government financing for a very ambitious rollout of HPV vaccine for boys and girls in Indonesia. So you see that's sort of a package, right, of where we can across sort of some of the government investments and the private sector investment, including with know-how and expertise and joint venture from international companies, really make a difference. I want to give in one other example, more low income, which is Côte d'Ivoire, where we work on a results-based financing program. So our financing of $350 million is linked to outcomes in primary healthcare delivery, but we accompany that with an investment in the private sector for diagnostics and oncology care, because even low-income settings need to have one hospital where cancer cases can be treated, right? And so it's really looking at what we do is support governments to look at national levels, put their policy priorities, and then use different levers to finance. And maybe make a final point is that we oftentimes find in those conversations that the extent of innovations is so broad and so wide that it's very overwhelming to navigate, right? And so some of the technical assistance and policy dialogue is around how to filter and sift through which are really those innovations that merit financing them at scale from whatever resource.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for highlighting, the context when you are in a context of scarce resources and emphasizing the importance of using different financial levers that will enable a step change, but the difficulties that we are facing today with kind of cuts in funding. What I'd like to do now is to move into our next part of our cycle. Sorry, I have my back to everybody. The impact of this investment and growth on security and preparedness, and the impact on resilience. And for this, I'm going to turn to Dr. Fink-Hoyer and Dr. Lobritz. Dr. Fink-Hoyer, HERA was born from the COVID-19 crisis, and I suppose it really did lay bare how emergency preparedness isn't just about health, it's really about resilience and security. So could you share with us now, how much better would you say the EU is prepared for the next health crisis than it was before COVID-19?
Very tricky questions. If I say, yes, we are better prepared, people will expect the moon from us. And if I say, no, we are not better prepared, people would say, what have you spent your money on? So it's very tricky. But the truth is somewhere in between, because obviously you never prepared for all. But what you can do is go for structural investments that would allow you to reduce the lead time. And I give you two examples just now from the hantavirus and from Ebola. Hantavirus was actually had the ingredients of a perfect storm, because we had 23 nations involved. And I must say it showed in a way that the way we are now working within the Commission across different services, but also with the member states, with ECDC, that we actually managed to have a very transparent, a very responsible, but also very quick containment. It's still not over, because it's 65 days of incubation, but it means that we are now managing it in a way that we were building on trust and people understood the system. So that is a positive example. Ebola, we, of course, now are all having to see what we have to deliver and can deliver. But I can say that the investment that we did before into, for instance, genomic sequencing, the pathogen genomic sequencing, which we financed throughout Africa, had an effect because we did this together with Africa CDC, and it allowed to identify in Kinshasa the right strain, which nobody knew before. So that helps, of course, reduce the lead time. Or when we had pre-financed, co-financed with others, the emergency hub of the WHO in Dakar, which now has already delivered on the ground, for me that allows at least a very first, absolutely not enough, but a first response without taking much time at all. It was very, very quick. Now, we had just not so long ago had a huge exercise with our member states on a health emergency, a fictional case. And of course, a few months ago, we would always have thought the biggest crisis could be avian flu mutation from human to human. Well, we were wrong, but we tried and tested all our systems, and it worked. And member states are quite familiar now on the regulatory frameworks that we have, the scalability that we have, also for the manufacturers and so on, from really the whole pipeline from diagnostic, early signals, diagnostics, therapeutics, bring it to market. We heard here joint procurement, we have no pool procurement, but also then even stockpiling and so on. What we also learned is if you want to go for health emergencies, we have to innovate. So our interest is very much innovation. And we cannot just innovate because we look at threat size, but also in the financing mechanisms. So we do work with, for instance, pre-commercial procurement. We work with public-private partnership in venture capital together with the European Investment Bank and so on and so on. Because otherwise we are not convincing our political leaders that the investment is a very effective one. Another one, what we also realized is you have to go beyond health in a very narrow sense. We speak, as you mentioned it now, about resilience. Resilience across a much broader threat spectrum. We look basically at, we look at the 12 viral families, of course, but we look at 4 bigger threat scenarios, so pandemics, or pathogens with pandemic potential, vector-borne diseases and contact-based, animal reservoir diseases, AMR still, and cyber and armed conflict. And we do have now also a civil military unit in order to really look at that type of threat scenario, because it's a very growing one for us as well, because we all know that it could also be with AI abused into other types of artificial or intentionally produced pathogens. So that's one thing. What I can also say is you have to really see the end-to-end approach. You cannot stop at one part, and we cannot deliver on a response if I have not invested in surveillance, but then go through this valley of death. And that means also you have to work very, very closely with manufacturers, with industry. And that's what we're doing a lot in order to help bridging that gap with the smaller ones, but also with the bigger ones. And we need to have a really a large landscape of that. Many people talk always about local capacity building. You know that the European Union is really heavily investing in local capacity building in third countries. We really strongly believe in that. It's part of our MCM strategy, it's part of our Global Health Resilience Initiative. But we actually also face a local manufacturing threat inside. So if I want to keep preparedness, I need to convince that health and medical countermeasures are strategic assets. I have to keep that production capacity within Europe as well. And I have to also take a look at the supply chain vulnerabilities, about the geopolitical situation, and that all I have to factor in. But that's what we do on a very, very systematic manner. Thank you.
So I think we can safely conclude that the EU is better prepared, but
yeah. We do our best.
So what about the pharmaceutical industry, Dr. Lobritz? How is the pharmaceutical industry reframing preparedness and resilience as a long-term investment rather than a crisis response?
So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. It's a great question, and I want to think about this from the framework of how innovation happens. And I love very much the phrase, always innovating, right? So if we just take a single case study example, the 326-day turnaround from identification of COVID to the delivery of vaccines is just a phenomenal innovation outcome. But it's predicated on decades of foundational research around the utilization of RNA-based therapeutics and on vaccine delivery generally to be able to make that happen. So what looks fast is really secretly long and challenging, right? And I think when we think about that big pipeline of medicines that was brought up in the very beginning, you think of that smooth healthcare process like a duck through a river. In reality, you look underneath and you see how fast the feet are pedaling. And that's what I want to look at in a little bit more detail for this particular panel. And what we're asking when you ask the question around how are pharmaceutical companies preparing for strategic preparedness and resilience, you're asking the question, what does it take to make a medicine? So I'm a physician by background as well. I've been in the industry for about 10 years, and I was honestly stunned when I first arrived from my academic post into industry as to what actually went into the work to deliver one single new medicine. Greater than 10 years, hundreds of skilled workers, and information and insights that really transcend sectors, not just within the single pharmaceutical company, but across sectors integrating. And with that, a sector-wide outcome looks like success rates of around 1 out of 12 projects becoming medicines when we think about that pipeline. So being very realistic around how much as the pharmaceutical industry as a strategic sector is involved in mitigating and discharging risk to deliver medicines is an important factor. And so the easiest way to think about this in my mind is actually to move to a different sector and to think about the restaurant industry. So Anthony Bourdain was an American chef and writer, and he was a fierce advocate for the restaurant industry. And one of the things he used to say is that it is amazing how people believe that their meal begins when their plate of food is served to them in a restaurant. And it belies the thousands upon thousands of person hours that were required to allow for that food to arrive hot and fresh at their table. The work of sourcing, preparing, growing, et cetera, right? So imagine in the pharmaceutical sector, as the analogy comes to a close, that the dinner rush has arrived. One of the secrets of the restaurant industry and where it differs is that we absolutely know how to make food. And every single meal is going to come out. Imagine the dinner rush arrives and we haven't prepared ourselves. And in fact, 11 of those 12 meals are actually unsafe to eat or lack the nutrition that is necessary. This is the fundamental work of pharmaceutical companies. It's a group, it is a strategic partner, a strategic sector, which is composed of really unique capabilities to deliver ideas into medicines.
Thank you very much for that analogy. Now, I'm just going to switch to this seat. Dr. Valletta apologized. She had to rush off to another engagement, so I'm just going to sit here and to continue with that restaurant analogy, because I suppose if the dinner rush isn't prepared and we're looking at a pandemic, pandemics are projected to cost over $700 billion each year if there is no preparation. So again, back to this question of innovating and investing in that innovation. It's both obviously essential in terms of economic stability and health security. So continuing on that idea, Dr. Lobritz, given that there are today modest investments in preparedness to avert major economic losses, where do you see the greatest vulnerabilities in health resilience today?
So I think the greatest vulnerabilities we have, I would frame as the 3 Fs it is fragility, it is fragmentation, and it is folly. And I'll walk through those three pieces. So fragility is looking at the pipeline. So we mentioned 5,000 candidate medicines in the pipeline for cancer. Intrepid Alliance reported that there are currently 18 clinical compounds for 14 different viral families. If we take our math before, of 1 out of 12 actually becoming a medicine, that's about 1.5 medicines for 14 viral families. That is a fragile pipeline. The same is true of antimicrobial resistance. The challenges in that marketplace means that we do not see investor capital. We're reliant upon extremely important groups like CARB-X, like the AMR Action Fund, like HERA, like BARDA, to support that innovation framework and get to our minimum critical mass of pipeline innovation agents that can become medicines. Fragmentation is around how our ecosystems work together, and I absolutely agree with the public-private partnership model as a key approach. To deliver any of these essential preventatives, therapeutics, diagnostics, we need people working across the sector around the problem and identifying their niche and what they do best and filling that. The last is folly, and the way I think of this is it's a belief that we can scale up in the setting of pandemic, right? That when the dinner rush happens, we'll be able to do it. We did it before, we'll do it again. And I think that failure to prepare, the failure to be anticipatory is one of the great challenges.
Okay, well then, Dr. Frank-Hoyer, so what would you say then in response to Dr. Lobritz? What would help justify, in terms of governments, to help justify sustained investment in health security, innovation in vaccines and medicines before the dinner rush, before the crisis unfolds?
Well, I give you a very good example from ourselves. We had quite a stable budget, and then the political levels decided, which our budgetary authorities, the Parliament and the Council, said, well, we have security as a major risk, so we lost 1 billion. That's a big amount. Because, indeed, health got the lower priority. It's very clear. So now we had to explain, and we had to be more efficient, even, and more convincing. That means, talking about the dinner rush, we work a lot with industry in order to have a clarity about who can deliver what type of dish, if you are to stay in that. We work with reservation contracts, which cost, but that allows us to have a clear number of vaccines ready when we need, and we can also impose then on industry, depending on the level of emergency, to put other things aside. So that would help us in a real crisis. But it means also, first of all, you build up a trust relationship also with industry, because we need to know that they share with us what do they have as ingredients, what would they be ready to transfer as tech transfers, and so on and so on. So that means a constant investment. And let's be honest, as much as, of course, I do look at the European autonomy and the industrial base, we need global partnerships, that's for sure. And of course, we need intelligent partnerships. I mentioned already that we need to look at the entire pipeline. I mentioned quasi or venture capital arrangements. But I give you an example you mentioned already. I think you mentioned both. I'm not sure whether you mentioned CARB-X or CARB-B. We work with both. We were at the summit in Lyon, the One Health Summit, and we announced the 30 million. But the 30 million means we look at the entire pipeline and we make a smart, thanks to them as well, accept them that, a combination, because we said, well, one starts with a more fundamental research and the other one then goes on the second stage, especially when we look at that pipeline for AMR, that in this case it was AMR. So that means we start with promising candidates, and once we have them, we feed them into the clinical development. And that's how we work basically with almost everybody. We really look how we can have combinations. Otherwise, it would be very difficult because the clinical trials are the bottleneck. It's super expensive. But then what does it help if we have then a promising candidate and a contract, but then there's no market? Because many of for the real health emergencies, these are often niche products because people would not expect and not hope that we would have in a health emergency. We would not have hoped to have this virus now in DRC. We actually looked at developing a Sudan Ebola strain and vaccines for that. That's where we invested. We thought the other one, the third one, is very seldom, right? Hantavirus, we also just started. So this is where we look on threat analysis, but we have to make sure that we also create a market afterwards, which we partly can because we know we would need therapeutics. For instance, we are now just worked with the Global Coalition for Therapeutics Development, or CEPI now, that we give them the funding because we know we will need the products. But then we also have to make sure there is either joint procurement at the end, or stockpiling, or let's say a market, or a revolving way with reservation contracts. I think this is the way to ensure that there is the scalability. But scalability must be possible throughout the entire chain. And that means you really have to make your market analysis quite well, but also, as I said, have corporations. I mean, it's not an easy business because sometimes you might go, we hope not to go on the wrong one, but as I said, we looked at the Ebola Sudan one, which would have been the most likely one, for which we also don't have a candidate, and we will continue investing in it because it might come. And hopefully not quick, but this is, I mean, medical countermeasures are insurance. We don't want to have them. We don't want to use them, but it is extremely costly to have them because if you're not looking in a structural prevention preparedness way, you will never be able to have a response. So you take risk, and you have to convince those who held the purse to say, but that's your insurance, like a car insurance. You had different changes. We always talk about you would not like your house to be burnt down. You take an insurance. But hopefully it will never be used, but it does cost you. And that's the way the philosophy goes.
Thank you very much for that new analogy, but also really helping us understand the kind of the difficulties in scaling up right across the supply chain to be prepared. Now, I'm going to ask you all just to make your answers a bit quicker, and we're going to have a bit more quick-fire questions to you all, and I'm going to touch on different topics now, because one thing that, drawing on something Dr. Fink-Hoyer was talking about at the beginning of her answer, was about the question of trust. Question of trust right through from, partnerships right through the whole kind of industrial scale and through the entire pipeline. And that really draws right down essentially to the patient. And this is something I know that you're very passionate about, and that is the partnership with patients. How does that help unlock innovation?
Yeah. So I always tell my team, and I tell them this often, that trust is what connects science and outcomes. Just think about it. If a patient doesn't trust, and healthcare providers don't trust a new innovation, if they don't trust the entity that provided that innovation, then they won't take it. There won't be any uptake. And of course, then that means that innovation won't have the intended good outcome that we had hoped it would have. And we're seeing this play out right now with, I think, vaccine hesitancy. Unfortunately, even for safe and well-established vaccines, we're seeing the uptake rates go down, and diseases are returning that we are really preventable and that we never thought we would see again. And it's a significant problem, but it's not a scientific problem. It's a trust and engagement problem. So I think we have to think about, how do we build trust? I don't have a magic wand. I don't pretend to know all the answers. But what I would say is I think we have to engage patients earlier. You know, right now we have patient advisory boards. They're kind of perfunctory. You know, we bring them in late stage. And so what we started to do at J&J, and I think it's so important, is to really bring them in before phase 3. We've been, you know, doing more structured benefit risk assessments, finding out what matters to the patient, and how do we actually think about our products as we're moving forward, given what really matters most to them. I think also we have to think about how we use their data. With AI, I've already seen in the last 3 or 4 weeks, you know, a lot of articles that remind me so much of the backlash against vaccines, of backlash against AI, but yet I think it holds the most promise, incredible promise, for democratizing medicine in a way that, you know, has not heretofore been possible. So really helping them understand how we're going to use their data, and respecting their data privacy, being transparent about it, and actually making sure that we're providing the results back to them is super important. The final thing I'll say that I think will really help with trust is real-world evidence. You know, healthcare providers or even patients can roll their eyes and say, okay, yeah, it worked in a really controlled setting in this clinical trial, but will it work in the real world? And so I think now we have methodologies that we haven't had before that are continuing to improve on how to conduct real-world studies. And I think that, you know, it's so important to do that, and then to provide that data, and to provide it in a way that's consumable to patients. I mean, with AI, they can search and they can find it, but it's so often technical, they don't understand it. And so I think that is really a mandate for the pharmaceutical industry, to really provide it in a consumable way so that patients can understand it. So I guess, you know, bottom line is I don't see patient trust and innovation as separate things. I actually think that patient-centered care can actually increase innovation, and because it can increase the relevance of that innovation, increase scalability, and trust in that innovation.
Okay, so patient-centered care, absolutely essential, and really good to have that point now. So if we continue our rapid-fire questions, then you're explaining you have so many, you know, you're juggling so many different things in terms of kind of building up the capability of the EU in terms of preparedness. If you had to identify one single thing that you would say would make a real difference to help the EU be prepared for that next black swan event, that next threat, what would it be?
Can I just react on the other question?
Of course you can.
Because one way, apart from science-based contradiction to mis and disinformation, is also provide alternatives. We always look at vaccines. We really need to also look at therapeutics. And even in the vaccines, we have to go for different types. I mean, is it mRNA? Is it protein-based? Or is it differently administered, like a nasal spray or something like that? That can also help, because not everybody is able to take the same type of medicine. So that, of course, is costly as well, but it in an emergency would also help, and that's also what I think with industry we're factoring in. Now I come to your question. I think I said it already, really look at health as a strategic asset. And as you mentioned AI, I also have to say another word on that, because it has the positive and the negative side. It holds enormous potential, especially clinical trials and everything. But it also holds the dark side. And that brings me more in the civil military area and so on. And that is where our next threats will lie. And there, we hope we will not wake up only when we have a crisis. That would be too late. So we have to always think ahead. We always have to anticipate, work with all the actors along the value chain, from the patients, the industry, and everybody else, the scientists as well, and then try to be at least preventive in our approaches.
Okay, so staying with that thought, Dr. Fink-Hoyer said that health is a strategic asset. If you were able to correct, I suppose, a misconception of policymakers about the cost of preparedness, what would it be, and what would you like policymakers to do differently as a result?
I think it was said earlier, and I'll reiterate it, that health really is wealth. I think Penny's example of the secondary effects of vaccination around long-term health are just absolutely profound. And what I would say, sort of what we need is more of the peacetime collaboration, right? And I'll give sector-wide and then local example, right? So from a sector-wide perspective, looking at the AMR Action Fund, CARB-X, GARD-P, these organizations are now becoming foundations of how we deliver the antibiotics portfolio. They are essential elements. If I look at other mechanisms, I would look locally with Roche, which we just announced the voluntary license agreement of an influenza drug, baloxavir, with Medicines Patent Pool. It was designed to enable access of potentially life-saving medicine in low- and middle-income countries. And we're doing that outside of the context of a pandemic, outside of this seasonal time, to make that available. So I think voluntary licensure as a mechanism is a really a critical element.
Okay, so now in one sentence, I want you to summarize everything you've been thinking in one sentence. And the question to answer would be, what do you think the policymakers most underestimate about the value of health innovation? And the answer that I'm looking for is, what is it going to take to change that? Let me begin with you, Michael Obritz, because you began by answering that a little bit.
If I were to synthesize what my position that I want to get across.
In a sentence.
It's in one sentence. The creation of a novel medicine that changes the course of the life of an individual is not an eventuality or a certainty, and it needs to be supported.
Very profound and actually encapsulated very much what we had to say. Thank you.
I can't beat that. Wow, I would, now I have to think. If medical countermeasures or health, whatever you call it, are strategic assets, also from an economic side of view, you have to go away from ad hoc solutions to structured investment.
Yeah, away from ad hoc to structured. Thank you very much. And Dr. Penny Heaton, last word.
Yeah, I think that we need to align around the value of medicine and that we need to see it as a health innovation. It's not a near-term cost, but it's a long-term investment in a nation's resiliency, their productivity, and their growth.
Fantastic panel, brilliant conversation, and thank you so much for those very incisive concluding remarks. Big round of applause. Thank you very much.